Welcome to the sci-fi universe, where each scene unfolds with immersive visuals that bring the story to life. Let's begin the journey. The Zilthar diplomatic ship floated silently above the barren human colony, its sleek design reflecting the cold efficiency of the race it represented. Inside, the dim lighting cast long shadows across the walls, and the soft hum of advanced systems filled the air with a low, constant vibration. Larana, the Zilthar diplomat, stood in the center of her private chamber, her hands moving gracefully as she completed the ritualistic gestures that had been passed down through generations of her people. The preparation for the negotiation was more than just tradition, it was a reaffirmation of her commitment to her duty and the superiority of her race. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the ship's communication system activating. "Ambassador Larana, the human delegation is ready for the negotiation," came the voice of her aide, Coulter, steady and devoid of emotion. Larana straightened, her eyes narrowing with determination. She had faced humans before, always finding them lacking barbaric, emotional, and far too unpredictable. But this negotiation was crucial. The Zilthar's recent expansion efforts had brought them into closer proximity with human colonies, and while her superiors believed in maintaining a fragile peace, Larana saw no reason to compromise with a species she considered inferior. The negotiation room on the ship was as cold and sterile as the rest of the vessel. As Larana entered, she observed the human delegation with thinly veiled disdain. They were dressed in practical uniforms, their expressions ranging from cautious to hopeful. Larana's own attire, a flowing robe of deep indigo adorned with silver accents, symbolized the dignity of her people. The discussion began as expected, with pleasantries and formalities exchanged. But it quickly deteriorated when Larana laid out her demands that were non-negotiable in her eyes. The humans, led by a man named Commander Vance, balked at her rigid terms. Their voices rose, emotion creeping into their words as they attempted to reason with her. "This is unreasonable," Ambassador Larana, Commander Vance finally said, his tone sharp. "If we accept your terms, it will cripple our colony's ability to sustain itself. There must be room for compromise." "Compromise is a weakness," Larana replied coolly, her eyes narrowing. "The Zilthar do not bend to the whims of lesser species." The atmosphere in the room grew tense, the humans exchanging frustrated glances. Larana felt a flicker of satisfaction. She had anticipated their resistance, knowing that it would only confirm her low opinion of them. But just as she was about to press further, a sudden shudder ran through the ship, causing the lights to flicker. "What is happening?" she demanded, her composure slipping for the first time. "Ambassador, we've detected a solar flare in the area. The ship's systems are malfunctioning." Coulter's voice came through the communication system, tinged with alarm. Before Larana could respond, the ship lurched violently, and the floor beneath her seemed to drop away. The humans scrambled to steady themselves, but Larana's focus was on the increasingly erratic behavior of the ship's systems. The hum of the engines fluctuated wildly, and alarms blared throughout the vessel. "Prepare for an emergency landing on the human colony," Coulter ordered, his voice barely audible over the din of the failing systems. Larana clenched her jaw, fury and frustration boiling within her. To be forced to land on a human colony, of all places, was an insult. But there was no choice. The ship was no longer under her control. The landing was rough, the ship touching down with a jarring impact that threw Larana against the wall. She recovered quickly, straightening her robes and regaining her composure. When the ship finally settled, she made her way to the exit, her expression set in a mask of disdain. As the hatch opened, the oppressive heat of the colony hit her like a wave. The air was thick with dust, the red sands of the planet swirling in the wind. The spaceport was a crude, industrial area, with rusted machinery and hastily constructed buildings. Larana stepped out, her gaze sweeping across the desolate landscape with contempt. She had barely taken a few steps when a figure approached her. He was a human, his uniform marking him as an engineer. He was tall, with sandy hair and a steady, calm demeanor. He stopped a respectful distance away, offering a nod. "Ambassador Larana, I'm Ethan. I've been assigned to assist you during your stay here," he said, his tone polite but lacking the deference she was used to. Larana's eyes narrowed. "I do not need your assistance, human." My people will be here shortly to retrieve me." Ethan's expression didn't falter, though a hint of determination flashed in his eyes. "With respect, Ambassador, your ship is in no condition to leave the planet. It will take time to repair the damage. In the meantime, I'm here to help ensure your comfort and safety." "Your primitive solutions are of no interest to me," Larana replied coldly, brushing past him as she continued towards the nearest building. Ethan didn't follow, but his voice reached her again. "You might be surprised by what we humans can offer, Ambassador." Larana ignored him, her thoughts seething with indignation. The idea that she, as Silthar diplomat, would have to rely on human assistance was unbearable. But as she reached the building, she was struck by the stark reality of the situation. The environment was harsh, the heat and dust clinging to her clothes and skin in a way that made her long for the controlled climate of her ship. Reluctantly, she realized that she would need to tolerate Ethan's presence, at least for the time being. She couldn't afford to show weakness, but neither could she ignore the practicalities of her situation. With a deep breath, she turned back to where Ethan still stood, waiting patiently. "Very well, human," she said, her voice clipped. "You may assist me, but do not mistake this for trust or acceptance. I am merely acting out of necessity." Ethan nodded, a faint smile touching his lips. "Understood, Ambassador. Let's get you settled in." As they walked together towards the colony's main building, Larana couldn't shake the feeling that her disdain for humans had only deepened. Yet there was something about Ethan, his calm persistence, perhaps that gnawed at the edges of her certainty. For now she would keep her distance, both physically and emotionally, but the encounter had left her with an unsettling sense that things were about to become far more complicated. The engineering bay was a chaotic labyrinth of tools, parts, and half-finished projects. The air was thick with the smell of oil and metal, and the clanging of machinery reverberated off the walls. Larana stood at the entrance, her discomfort evident as she took in the disarray before her. The efficiency and precision of Silthar technology were nowhere to be found in this human workshop, and it grated on her senses. Ethan led the way inside, his steps confident as he navigated the cluttered space. He glanced back at Larana, noticing her hesitation. "I know it's not what you're used to, but this is where we'll be working to get your ship back in the air," he said, his tone casual. Larana's eyes narrowed as she picked her way through the workshop, careful to avoid the various pieces of equipment scattered on the floor. "This workshop is a testament to the lack of discipline and order among your kind," she remarked, her voice tinged with disdain. Ethan didn't seem offended by her words. Instead, he shrugged and offered a small smile. "Maybe so, but it gets the job done. And right now, that's what matters." Larana said nothing, choosing instead to observe as Ethan began inspecting the damage to her ship's systems. She couldn't deny his competence. His hands moved with practiced ease as he assessed the situation, making adjustments and taking notes. Despite herself, Larana found a sliver of respect forming for the human engineer's skill, though she kept that thought firmly to herself. Just as Ethan was explaining the repair process, a low rumble echoed through the bay. The sound grew louder, and within moments, the doors of the bay slammed shut, sealing them inside. Outside, the wind howled, carrying with it a cloud of red dust that battered the building. "Sandstorm," Ethan muttered, his expression tightening as he quickly moved to secure the area. "Looks like we're stuck here for a while." Larana frowned, her discomfort growing as the noise from the storm intensified. "Is this colony so ill-prepared that you cannot even predict and prevent such occurrences?" she asked, her tone accusatory. Ethan glanced at her as he finished locking down the machinery. "Sandstorms are common here, but they can be unpredictable. We're safe inside, but it's going to be a while before it blows over." The storm's fury seemed to grow with every passing minute, the walls of the bay vibrating under the force of the wind. The noise was oppressive, a constant reminder of the harshness of the environment. Larana wrapped her arms around herself, more to shield herself from the unfamiliar than from the cold. Seeing her discomfort, Ethan gestured to a corner where a small, makeshift seating area had been set up. "Why don't we sit down? There's nothing we can do until the storm passes." Reluctantly, Larana followed him, taking a seat on one of the metal crates. The silence between them was thick with unspoken thoughts, but it was Ethan who broke it first. "Do you know much about this colony?" he asked, his tone conversational as he leaned back against the wall. "It's been a tough place to live, but it's home to a lot of people who are trying to make something of themselves." "I am aware of its existence," Larana replied, her voice measured, "but I have no interest in human settlements. They are irrelevant to the Zelthar." Ethan nodded, seemingly unbothered by her dismissal. "I get that, but you should know, the people here, they're good folks, for the most part, just trying to survive, like everyone else." Larana tilted her head slightly, regarding him with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. "Why do you tell me this? Do you seek to change my opinion of your kind?" He shrugged again, a small smile playing on his lips. "Maybe. Or maybe I just think you should know that not all humans are as you perceive them." Larana considered his words, her gaze drifting to the bay's ceiling as the storm continued to rage outside. The Zelthar had always viewed humans with contempt, seeing them as a chaotic, warlike species. And yet, here was this human, calmly sitting beside her, speaking of cooperation and survival. It was almost intriguing. Out of boredom more than anything else, Larana decided to indulge him. "The Zelthar value order and efficiency," she began, her voice softening slightly as she spoke. "Our society is built on the principles of discipline and control. Chaos, as you humans embrace it, is anathema to us." Ethan listened attentively, nodding as she spoke. "I can see that," he said after a moment. "And I get why you'd look at this place and think it's a mess. But there's a kind of order here, too. It's just different." Larana remained silent, her mind turning over his words. Different. It was a concept she had never truly considered when it came to humans. To her, different had always meant inferior. But as she sat there, trapped by the storm and unable to do anything but talk, she found herself wondering if perhaps there was more to this chaotic race than she had assumed. Their conversation was interrupted by a sudden, louder crash from somewhere within the bay. Ethan shot to his feet, moving quickly toward the source of the noise. Larana followed, her instincts alert. They found the source of the disturbance. One of the larger machines had been dislodged by the storm's vibrations and was now leaning precariously, threatening to topple over and cause significant damage to the equipment around it. Without hesitation, Ethan began working to stabilize the machine, but it was clear he couldn't do it alone. For a moment, Larana hesitated, her pride warring with the practicality of the situation. Then, with a resigned sigh, she moved to assist him. Together, they managed to secure the machine, and Ethan gave her an appreciative nod. "Nice work, Ambassador. I didn't expect you to." "Do not mistake this for a change in my opinion," Larana cut in sharply, straightening her robe. "I merely acted out of necessity." Ethan chuckled softly, but he didn't press the issue. Instead, he returned to his seat, gesturing for Larana to join him once more. "Fair enough. But you know, you've got some pretty impressive technical skills. I can see why you're a diplomat." Larana regarded him with a mixture of surprise and suspicion. It was rare for a human to offer genuine praise to a Zelthar, especially one as openly disdainful as she had been. "I am well trained," she replied cautiously. "But my skills are not something that should concern you." Ethan shrugged, leaning back again. "I just think it's worth acknowledging. We're going to be working together to get your ship fixed, after all." The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the bay, a tenuous sense of understanding had begun to form. It was not trust, far from it, but there was a flicker of mutual respect, born from necessity and circumstance. As the hours passed and the storm finally began to subside, Ethan stood and stretched, glancing over at Larana. "Looks like it's finally letting up. We can get back to work soon." Larana nodded, though her thoughts were elsewhere. The conversation they had shared had unsettled her in ways she hadn't anticipated. She had always viewed humans as beneath her, but Ethan's calm demeanor and persistence were slowly chipping away at the walls she had built around herself. But just as they were preparing to return to their work, Ethan paused, his brow furrowing as he inspected one of the ship's panels. "That's strange." Larana's eyes narrowed. "What is it?" Ethan knelt down, examining the wires and circuitry with a practiced eye. "There's something off here. It looks like sabotage." The word hung in the air, heavy with implication. Larana's expression hardened, her mind racing. Sabotage. Could it be that her stranding on this planet was not an accident? And if so, who could be behind it? For the first time since their encounter began, Larana felt a pang of fear. The situation was far more complex than she had realized, and the stakes were higher than she had ever imagined. But one thing was clear: she could no longer afford to dismiss Ethan as just another human. Whether she liked it or not, he was now a crucial part of whatever was to come. "Show me," she said, her voice steely as she joined him at the panel. As they examined the damage together, the storm outside faded into the background, its fury replaced by a growing sense of urgency. The conspiracy they had uncovered was just the beginning, and Larana knew that their uneasy alliance would be tested in ways neither of them could yet foresee. The colony's central hub was a cacophony of sounds, a stark contrast to the cold silence Larana had grown accustomed to on her ship. The hub was alive with activity, bustling with humans and a few other alien species, each going about their business. The air was filled with the sounds of conversations in various languages, the clicking of machines, and the hum of life in all its chaotic forms. To Larana it was overwhelming, a sensory overload that grated on her nerves. She moved through the throng with Ethan by her side, his presence a steadying influence in the sea of unfamiliarity. Larana's sharp eyes caught glimpses of the humans around her. Many were curious, some wary, and a few openly hostile. It wasn't surprising. She was, after all, a Zilthar, and the tensions between their species were palpable, especially after the failed negotiation. As they made their way through the hub, Larana received a message on her personal communicator. The encrypted transmission bore the seal of the Zilthar High Council. Her heart skipped a beat as she discreetly accessed the message, her eyes narrowing as she read the contents. Ambassador Larana, remain vigilant. Trust no one. The humans are not to be trusted, and neither are the intentions of all within our own ranks. Maintain your distance and do not waver from our goals. The message was clear. Her superiors were warning her to keep her guard up, but the cryptic reference to untrustworthy elements within her own government unsettled her. What was the council hiding? Larana glanced at Ethan, who was focused on guiding her through the hub. He had proven to be more competent and trustworthy than she had initially believed, but the message gnawed at her, deepening her suspicion. Could it be that the sabotage they discovered wasn't just a random act of malice but part of a larger conspiracy? And if so, who was behind it? "Something on your mind?" Larana Ethan asked, noticing her distraction. Larana's gaze flicked to him, her expression guarded. "Just considering our next move," she replied curtly. Ethan nodded, accepting her answer without pressing further. "We need to find out who tampered with your ship. If there's someone working against you or both of us, we need to know who they are." They arrived at the edge of the hub, where the crowd thinned, giving way to a series of more secluded corridors. These paths led to various administrative offices and quarters, far from the hustle and bustle of the main area. It was here that they hoped to find answers. Larana was acutely aware of the stares directed at her as they walked. A group of colonists passed by, their faces hard with suspicion. One of them, a burly man with a scowl etched into his features, stepped into their path, blocking their way. "What's a Zilthar doing here?" he demanded, his voice thick with disdain. "Aren't you the ones who think you're too good for the likes of us?" Ethan moved to intervene, but Larana raised a hand, stopping him. She met the man's gaze, her own eyes cold and unyielding. "I am here to ensure that peace is maintained," she said evenly. "Nothing more." The man sneered, but before he could say anything more, another colonist, a woman with sharp eyes, stepped forward. "We don't want any trouble, Jack," she said, her tone firm. "Let them pass." Jack hesitated, his gaze flicking between Larana and Ethan, before finally stepping aside. "Just remember, Zilthar, we don't take kindly to your kind sticking their noses where they don't belong." Larana didn't respond, merely inclining her head in a gesture of acknowledgement before continuing on. Ethan followed, his expression darkening as they moved further down the corridor. "That could have gone worse," he muttered. Larana gave a slight nod. "Humans are more direct in their hostility than I anticipated," she remarked. "But their intentions are clear, at least." Ethan glanced at her, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. I guess you could say that's one of our charms. They reached a set of unmarked doors at the end of the corridor, and Ethan paused, checking his surroundings before accessing the control panel. This should lead us to the records we need. If anyone on this colony has been involved in sabotage or other suspicious activities, there should be some trace of it here. The doors slid open with a soft hiss, revealing a small, dimly lit room filled with data terminals. The walls were lined with storage units, and the air was cool and still a stark contrast to the bustling hub they had just left behind. Larana wasted no time, moving to one of the terminals and beginning her search. Ethan joined her, his fingers flying over the controls as he sifted through the colony's records. The minutes ticked by in tense silence, the only sound the soft beeping of the terminals as they processed data. Finally, Larana found something. Her eyes narrowed as she scanned the information on the screen. It was a report classified and heavily redacted about an incident involving a Zelthar operative who had been working undercover among the humans. The report suggested that the operative had gone rogue, possibly aligning with a faction within the Azulthar government that opposed peaceful relations with humans. This is it, she murmured, her voice low. There's a faction within my government that's been working against us. They're the ones who sabotaged my ship. Ethan leaned over to read the report, his expression grim. If that's true, then we're dealing with more than just a few disgruntled colonists. This could be the start of something much bigger. Larana's mind raced as she considered the implications. If the faction within her government was powerful enough to carry out such a plot, then the peace between their species was in serious jeopardy. And if she reported this to her superiors, it could spark a conflict that would engulf not just the colony, but entire star systems. For the first time, Larana felt a pang of doubt. Could she trust her own people? And more importantly, could she trust Ethan, a human, with the information she had just uncovered? Before she could dwell on it further, the doors to the room suddenly slid open, and a group of colonists entered, led by the woman who had intervened earlier. She looked directly at Larana, her expression unreadable. "We need to talk," the woman said, her tone leaving no room for argument. Larana straightened, her eyes narrowing. "And who are you to demand that?" The woman stepped forward, her gaze steady. "My name is Alina. I work with the colony's internal security. We've been monitoring your activities since you arrived, Ambassador, and we know about the sabotage." Larana's heart skipped a beat, but she kept her expression neutral. "Then you know that I am not responsible." Alina nodded. "We do. But we also know that there are forces on this colony who would like to see you and your people fail, and they're not just working alone." Ethan stepped forward, his tone cautious. "What do you know?" Alina glanced at him, then back at Larana. "I know that there's a faction within the Azulthar government that wants to sabotage any chance of peace with humanity, and they're using this colony to do it." Larana exchanged a look with Ethan, her mind racing. If what Alina said was true, then they were in far more danger than she had realized. But before she could respond, Alina continued. "We want to help," she said, her tone firm. "But we need to know that you're on our side, all of you." Larana hesitated, torn between her duty to her people and the growing bond she felt with Ethan. The choice was not an easy one, and she knew that whatever decision she made, it would have far-reaching consequences. Finally she spoke, her voice steady but laced with uncertainty. "We have a common enemy. For now, that is enough." Alina studied her for a moment, then nodded. "It's a start." The tension in the room eased slightly, but the underlying danger remained. Larana knew that the road ahead would be fraught with challenges, and the alliance she had just formed was tenuous at best. But for now, it was all they had. As they left the room, Larana couldn't shake the feeling that the choices she made in the coming days would shape not only her own future, but the future of both their species, and the thought of that responsibility weighed heavily on her shoulders. The hidden laboratory was as cold and sterile as the secrets it concealed. Dim lighting cast eerie shadows on the walls, and the hum of advanced machinery filled the air with an ominous undertone. Larana and Ethan moved cautiously through the narrow corridors, their senses heightened by the knowledge that they were deep within enemy territory. The discovery of the laboratory had been a stroke of luck, or perhaps fate. After their encounter with Elena, Larana and Ethan had followed a series of leads that brought them to this remote section of the colony, far from prying eyes. Here, in the bowels of the settlement, the conspiracy they had uncovered began to take shape. As they approached the central chamber, Larana's pulse quickened. This was the heart of the operation, the place where the sabotage of her ship had been orchestrated and where the true nature of the plot against both their peoples would be revealed. Ethan glanced at her, his expression tense. "Are you ready for this?" Larana nodded, her voice steady despite the turmoil within her. "We have no choice. We must see this through." They entered the chamber, and Larana's breath caught in her throat. The room was filled with equipment far more advanced than anything she had seen on the colony. Banks of computers lined the walls, their screens flickering with data in languages she barely recognized. In the center of the room stood a figure, shrouded in the shadows, who turned to face them as they entered. "Ambassador Larana," the figure said, their voice smooth and cold. "I've been expecting you." Larana stepped forward, her eyes narrowing as she tried to make out the figure's features. "Who are you? And what is the meaning of this?" The figure stepped into the light, revealing a tall, slender Zilthar with a predatory smile. "My name is irrelevant. What matters is that I represent the true interests of our people, interests that do not align with the farcical peace you and your superiors pretend to pursue." Larana's heart sank as the realization dawned on her. This Zilthar was one of the conspirators, someone who had betrayed their own race for the sake of an agenda that could plunge both their worlds into chaos. "You're the one who sabotaged my ship," Larana said, her voice laced with anger. "You tried to kill me." The Zilthar's smile widened. "Not kill, Ambassador, merely delay. Your mission was always destined to fail. The only question was how long it would take you to see the truth." Ethan stepped forward, his hand hovering near his weapon. "And what truth is that?" The Zilthar's gaze shifted to Ethan, their expression disdainful. "That peace with humans is a lie, a distraction from the true destiny of the Zilthar. We are meant to dominate, not coexist." Larana's mind raced as she processed the implications of the Zilthar's words. If this conspiracy succeeded, it would mean the end of everything she had worked for, the end of any hope for a peaceful resolution to the conflict between their species. But there was still one question that burned in her mind. Why? Why betray your own people, your own race? The Zilthar's expression darkened. "Because our people have grown weak, Ambassador. We have forgotten what it means to be Zilthar. It is time to remind them." Before Larana could respond, the Zilthar raised a hand, and a series of alarms blared throughout the chamber. "Unfortunately, this is where our conversation ends. But don't worry, Ambassador. You won't have to wait long to see the fruits of our labor." The lights flickered, and the machinery in the room whirred to life, its purpose clear self-destruction. Larana's eyes widened as she realized what was happening. "Get down," she shouted, grabbing Ethan and pulling him to the floor just as the first explosion rocked the chamber. The room was engulfed in chaos, fire and smoke filling the air as the lab's systems overloaded. The Zilthar conspirator made a dash for the exit, but Ethan was faster. He drew his weapon and fired, the shot catching the Zilthar in the leg and sending them crashing to the ground. Larana scrambled to her feet, her heart pounding as she surveyed the destruction around them. They had only moments before the entire lab went up in flames. "Ethan, we have to go," she shouted, grabbing his arm and dragging him toward the exit. But Ethan hesitated, his gaze fixed on the fallen Zilthar. "We can't just leave him here." Larana's eyes narrowed in frustration. "He's the enemy, Ethan. We don't have time." Another explosion cut her off, the force of the blast throwing them both to the ground. The walls of the lab began to buckle, the ceiling threatening to collapse. Ethan pushed himself to his feet, his expression torn. "I can't do it, Larana. I can't just leave him to die." Larana hesitated for only a fraction of a second before making her decision. She cursed under her breath and moved to the fallen Zilthar, hoisting them onto her shoulder. "Then let's move, before we all die." Together they staggered through the burning lab, the heat and smoke making it difficult to see or breathe. Larana's muscles screamed in protest as she carried the weight of the conspirator, but she refused to slow down. They had to get out, there was no other option. Finally, they reached the exit, bursting out into the relative safety of the corridor, just as the lab behind them erupted in a final catastrophic explosion. The force of the blast knocked them off their feet, and they collapsed onto the cold metal floor, gasping for breath. For a moment, the only sound was the ringing in Larana's ears, the aftermath of the explosion still echoing in her mind. Then, slowly, she became aware of Ethan beside her, his chest rising and falling rapidly as he caught his breath. You didn't have to do that," he managed to say between gasps. "You could have left him." Larana shook her head, her expression unreadable. "I couldn't. Not if I wanted to live with myself afterward." She turned her gaze to the Zalthar conspirator, who was unconscious but still breathing. The injuries they had sustained were severe, but they would live at least for now. Ethan followed her gaze, his expression softening. "Thank you, Larana. For what it's worth. I'm glad you made that choice." Larana didn't respond immediately, her mind still reeling from the events that had just unfolded. She had made a choice, one that had put her at odds with everything she had been taught, everything she had believed. And yet, in that moment, it had felt like the only choice she could make. Finally, she looked at Ethan, her eyes reflecting a mix of emotions she couldn't fully express. "We still have a long way to go, Ethan. This isn't over." Ethan nodded, understanding the weight of her words. "No, it's not, but we'll face it together." The tension that had lingered between them since their first meeting seemed to dissipate, replaced by a sense of mutual respect and something more, a bond forged in the crucible of fire and danger. The colony's command center was a hive of activity, the air thick with tension and anticipation. The room was dominated by large screens displaying data streams, tactical maps, and live feeds from various parts of the colony. The hum of machines filled the space, punctuated by the occasional barked order or urgent discussion. Amidst the controlled chaos, Larana stood beside Ethan, her expression unreadable as she absorbed the gravity of their situation. Moments earlier, Larana had received a transmission from the Zalthar High Council. The message was brief, but clear: she was to return immediately to Zalthar territory, or she would be labeled a traitor. The weight of those words pressed down on her, stirring a conflict deep within her that she had not anticipated. Ethan watched her closely, sensing the turmoil beneath her composed exterior. He had uncovered evidence that the faction within the Zalthar government, the same faction responsible for the sabotage, was planning a direct attack on the colony. The urgency of their situation was palpable, and yet Larana remained silent, torn between her duty to her people and her growing bond with the human she had once despised. "Larana," Ethan said softly, drawing her attention. "You know what they're planning. We can't let them do this." Larana's eyes met his, and for a moment the room seemed to fade away. The decision before her was not just about choosing sides, it was about redefining who she was and what she stood for. The Zalthar High Council had always been her guide, her source of authority, but now their orders felt more like shackles than guidance. She took a deep breath, her voice calm but laced with uncertainty. "If I defy the council, there will be consequences. For me. For us." Ethan nodded, understanding the weight of her words. "But if you follow their orders, more than just our lives are at stake. The colony, the people here, they don't deserve to be caught in the crossfire of a war they didn't start." Larana's gaze drifted to the tactical maps on the screens, her mind racing. The attack would be swift and devastating, leaving the colony defenseless if they weren't prepared. But standing against her own people, it was a path she had never imagined taking. "Do what you believe is right," Ethan continued, his voice steady. "Not what you've been told, not what you've been taught, what you know in your heart is right." His words resonated with her, echoing the thoughts that had been swirling in her mind since their investigation began. For the first time, Larana saw the Zalthar not as an infallible force, but as a flawed entity capable of deceit and destruction. And in that moment, she made her choice. "We need to prepare the colony for the attack," she said, her tone firm. "We have little time." Ethan's expression softened, a mix of relief and admiration. "You're with us, then?" Larana nodded, the decision bringing a sense of clarity she hadn't expected. "Yes, we'll face this together." With that, they set to work. The colony's leaders and security forces were briefed on the impending attack, their initial skepticism giving way to grim determination as they realized the seriousness of the threat. Tensions ran high as preparations were made, barricades were reinforced, weapons distributed, and evacuation plans put in place for civilians. But as the colony braced for the assault, Larana and Ethan knew that their work was far from over. They needed more information, more intelligence on the enemy's movements and their plans. That meant going underground literally. Beneath the colony lay a network of tunnels, remnants from the early days of settlement when the humans had burrowed into the planet's surface for shelter from the harsh environment. Now, those tunnels were largely abandoned, save for a few that had been repurposed for storage and emergency access. It was here that Larana and Ethan suspected the enemy had hidden their weapons and equipment, preparing for the attack. The tunnels were dark and damp, the air thick with moisture and the scent of decay. The walls were slick with condensation, and the sound of dripping water echoed eerily in the confined space. Larana moved cautiously through the narrow passageways, her senses on high alert for any sign of danger. "This place gives me the creeps," Ethan muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Larana couldn't help but agree. The tunnels were a far cry from the clean, controlled environments she was used to, and the claustrophobic atmosphere was suffocating. But there was no turning back now. They had to find the hidden cache before it was too late. As they ventured deeper into the tunnels, the oppressive silence was broken only by the sound of their footsteps and the occasional drip of water. The walls seemed to close in around them, the darkness pressing in on all sides. But Larana forced herself to focus, to push aside the discomfort and fear that threatened to cloud her judgment. Finally, they reached a section of the tunnel that appeared to have been recently disturbed. The ground was uneven, and faint tracks led further into the darkness. Larana signaled for Ethan to stop, her hand hovering over her weapon as she scanned the area. "There," she whispered, pointing to a small alcove in the wall. "Something's been hidden there." Ethan approached cautiously, using a small flashlight to illuminate the area. As the light fell on the alcove, they saw a cache of weapons, carefully concealed behind a loose section of the wall. The weapons were advanced, clearly not of human origin, and their presence here confirmed their worst fears. "This is it," Ethan said, his voice tense. "They're planning to use these in the attack." Larana's heart pounded in her chest as she realized the full extent of the danger they were in. The enemy was closer than they had thought, and the attack could come at any moment. But before she could respond, a noise from further down the tunnel caught her attention, a faint, shuffling sound that sent a chill down her spine. "Someone's coming," she hissed, motioning for Ethan to hide. They ducked behind a stack of crates, their breaths held as the sound grew closer. The tunnel was too dark to see clearly, but the faint glow of a flashlight bobbed in the distance, accompanied by the soft murmur of voices. Larana's hand tightened on her weapon, her pulse racing as the figures drew nearer. She could make out two of them, their movements cautious as they approached the cache. She strained to hear their conversation, but the echo of the tunnel distorted the words. "They're here to check on the weapons," Ethan whispered, his voice barely audible. "We can't let them see us." Larana nodded, her mind racing as she considered their options. They were outnumbered, and any confrontation would likely draw more attention than they could handle. But if they didn't act now, they risked losing the element of surprise, and the cache would be moved to a location they might never find. "We have to act fast," she whispered back. "Take them down quietly. We can't afford to alert the others." Ethan nodded, his expression grim as he readied his weapon. Together they crept forward, keeping to the shadows as they closed in on the unsuspecting conspirators. The first man was focused on the cache, his back turned to them as he inspected the weapons. The second stood nearby, scanning the tunnel for any sign of intruders. Larana moved with practiced precision, her steps silent as she approached the first man. In a swift, fluid motion, she struck, her weapon connecting with the back of his head and rendering him unconscious before he could react. Ethan followed suit, taking down the second man with equal efficiency. The two conspirators crumpled to the ground, their weapons clattering on the stone floor. Larana and Ethan stood over them, their breaths coming in ragged gasps as the adrenaline coursed through their veins. "That was close," Ethan muttered, wiping sweat from his brow. Larana nodded, her mind already racing ahead. They had the cash, but the attack was still imminent. They needed to get back to the surface, warn the others, and prepare for what was to come. "Let's move," she said, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her. "We don't have much time." They left the unconscious conspirators where they lay, knowing that their time was running out. The tunnel seemed even more oppressive on the way back, the darkness heavier, the air thicker. But Larana pushed on, driven by a newfound determination, a determination to protect the colony, to stand by Ethan, and to do what she knew in her heart was right. As they emerged from the tunnels and returned to the command center, Larana felt the weight of her decision settle over her, like a cloak. She had chosen her path, and there was no turning back now. But even as the colony's leaders scrambled to prepare for the attack, she couldn't shake the feeling that the hardest part was still to come. The battle ahead would test her in ways she had never imagined, and the choices she made would shape the future of not just the colony, but of both their species. The colony's defensive perimeter was a fortress of tension. Barricades had been reinforced, weapon emplacements set up, and every able-bodied colonist armed and ready. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation, the kind that settled deep in the bones and refused to leave. Larana stood near the command post, surveying the preparations with a critical eye. She could feel the weight of the upcoming battle pressing down on her, a pressure that was as familiar as it was unwelcome. Ethan was beside her, his face set in grim determination. Despite the chaos around them, there was a calm between them, an unspoken understanding that they were in this together, whatever this turned out to be. "Do you think we're ready?" Ethan asked, his voice low, meant for her ears alone. Larana didn't answer immediately. Her gaze swept over the lines of nervous soldiers, the makeshift fortifications, and the civilians who had taken up arms to defend their home. They were as ready as they could be, but against the force that was coming, readiness might not be enough. "We'll find out soon enough," she replied, her tone betraying none of the fear that gnawed at her insides. The warning sirens blared, cutting through the tension like a knife. All around them, the colonists snapped to attention, their weapons at the ready. The attack was imminent. Larana moved to the front lines, taking command of a critical defensive position that overlooked the main approach to the colony. From here, she could see the distant shapes of the incoming Zilthar ships, their sleek forms cutting through the sky with terrifying precision. "They're coming," someone muttered, and the words rippled through the ranks like a chill wind. The first wave of the attack hit hard and fast. The Zilthar ships opened fire from a distance, their weapons tearing through the colony's outer defenses with brutal efficiency. The ground shook with the impact, sending dust and debris into the air. "Hold your positions," Larana shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. The colonists returned fire, their weapons lighting up the sky as they fought back with everything they had. But Larana could see that it wasn't enough. The Zilthar were too strong, their ships too powerful. They needed a new plan, something that would turn the tide of the battle. As the fighting raged on, Ethan joined her at the front, his face pale but resolute. "We can't hold out much longer," he said, his voice strained. "We need to take out their command ship." Larana knew he was right. The command ship was the linchpin of the Zilthar assault. If they could disable it, the rest of the fleet would be thrown into disarray. But it was a risky move, one that could cost them everything. "I'll take my ship," Larana said, her mind already calculating the odds. "It's the only one fast enough to get close." Ethan grabbed her arm, his eyes searching hers. "I'm coming with you." "No," Larana said firmly. "You're needed here." But Ethan shook his head, his grip tightening. "I'm not letting you do this alone. If we're going down, we're going down together." For a moment they stood there, the chaos of the battle swirling around them, and in that moment, Larana realized how much she cared for this stubborn, infuriating human. She had spent so long hating his kind, and now she was prepared to die by his side. "Fine," she said, relenting, "but stay close." They made their way to Larana's ship, now fully repaired and ready for one final mission. The interior was a blend of Zalthar and human technology, a symbol of the unlikely alliance that had formed between them. As they strapped in, Larana felt a strange sense of calm wash over her. This was the moment that would define everything. The ship launched into the sky, cutting through the atmosphere with ease. The battle raged below them, the colony fighting for its life as the Zalthar ships continued their assault. But Larana's focus was on the command ship, a massive vessel that loomed ahead, its weapons systems already locking onto them. "Hold on," she warned, pushing the ship to its limits as they dodged incoming fire. The space around them lit up with explosions as they weaved through the Zalthar fleet, their ship taking heavy damage with each near miss. The hull groaned under the strain, alarms blaring as systems began to fail. "We're not going to make it," Ethan shouted, his voice barely audible over the noise. "Yes, we will," Larana replied, her hand steady on the controls. "We have to." With a final burst of speed, they closed in on the command ship. Larana targeted its main power core, a critical weak point that, if destroyed, would cripple the entire vessel. "Firing," she said, her voice a mix of determination and desperation. The weapons discharged, the energy beams striking the command ship's core with pinpoint accuracy. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the entire ship shuddered, its systems shorting out in a cascade of sparks and explosions. "We did it," Ethan exclaimed, relief flooding his voice. But the victory was short-lived. The blast from the command ship sent a shockwave through the space around them, slamming into Larana's ship with devastating force. The controls went dead, the ship spiraling out of control as systems failed one by one. "Brace yourself," Larana shouted, struggling to regain control. But it was too late. The ship careened through space, the stars spinning wildly around them as they hurtled towards the planet's surface. The last thing Larana saw before everything went black was Ethan's hand reaching for hers, a silent promise that they would face whatever came next together. When she awoke, Larana found herself in the wreckage of her ship, the cold metal pressing against her as she struggled to move. Her body ached, her head throbbed, but she was alive. "Barely." "Ethan," she croaked, her voice hoarse. There was no response, and panic seized her chest. She forced herself to move, ignoring the pain as she crawled through the debris. Finally, she found him, slumped against the remains of the control console, unconscious but breathing. "Thank the stars," she whispered, relief washing over her. The ship was in ruins, their systems completely dead. They were stranded, floating in the void of space with no way to call for help. But the colony was safe, the Zalthar fleet in disarray without their command ship to guide them. "We did it," Larana murmured, sitting beside Ethan as she took his hand in hers. "We actually did it." But as the silence of space settled around them, Larana knew that their fight wasn't over. They had won the battle, but the war both within and without was far from decided. And as she sat there, holding on to the one person who had become her anchor in this storm, she resolved to see it through, no matter what the future held. The colony's medical bay was a stark contrast to the chaos that had engulfed them just hours before. The sterile white walls were bathed in soft light, creating an atmosphere of calm and recovery. The steady beeping of monitors and the low hum of machinery filled the air, a reminder of the countless lives that had been saved and the many more that still hung in the balance. Larana sat by Ethan's bedside, her hand gently resting on his, as she watched the rise and fall of his chest, the rhythm of his breathing reassuring her that he was still with her. Ethan stirred slightly, his eyes fluttering open. For a moment he looked disoriented, his gaze searching the room until it found Larana. A faint smile tugged at his lips, and he squeezed her hand weakly. "You're awake," Larana said softly, her voice betraying the relief she felt. "Yeah, I guess I am," Ethan replied, his voice hoarse but steady. Did we win?" Larana nodded, a small smile of her own forming. We did. The colony is safe. The Sylthar fleet retreated after we took out their command ship. Ethan let out a slow breath, his body relaxing as the tension drained away. Good. That's good. They sat in silence for a few moments, the weight of everything they had been through settling over them. The battle had been fierce, the stakes higher than they could have ever imagined, but they had come out the other side together. A soft chime sounded, and a nurse entered the room, her movements efficient as she checked Ethan's vitals. "You're one lucky man," she remarked with a smile. "We weren't sure you were going to make it for a while there." Ethan managed a weak chuckle. "Just stubborn, I guess." Larana watched as the nurse finished her work, making a few notes before leaving them alone again. As the door closed behind her, Larana felt a mix of emotions: relief, gratitude, and an underlying fear that she couldn't quite shake. "What happens now?" Ethan asked, his gaze shifting back to Larana. Larana hesitated, her mind racing as she considered the future that lay before them. "The colony is rebuilding," she said finally. "Humans and Zylthar are working together to repair the damage. There's talk of peace talks, real ones this time. The Sylthar government sent a message acknowledging the betrayal of the faction that led the attack. They're ready to negotiate." Ethan raised an eyebrow, surprised by the news. Peace talks. That's unexpected. "It is," Larana agreed. "But it's a start. We've proven that cooperation is possible, that we can work together for a common goal. It won't be easy, but it's a step in the right direction." Ethan nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "And us? What about us?" Larana looked down at their joined hands, the warmth of his touch grounding her in the moment. "We've been through so much, Ethan. I never expected any of this. But now, I can't imagine facing the future without you." Ethan squeezed her hand again, his eyes filled with an emotion that mirrored her own. "I feel the same way, Larana. I don't want to lose what we've found." A soft knock at the door interrupted their conversation, and they looked up to see one of the colony's leaders, a tall woman with silver hair and a commanding presence. She smiled warmly at them, stepping into the room. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said, her tone respectful, "but I wanted to personally thank you both for what you did. The colony owes you its survival." Larana inclined her head in acknowledgement. "We did what we had to do." The woman nodded. "And because of that, we're entering a new era. The peace talks will begin soon, and we'd like you both to be a part of them as representatives of this new alliance." Larana exchanged a glance with Ethan, who gave her a small nod of encouragement. "We would be honored," Larana replied. The leader smiled again, her expression one of genuine gratitude. "Thank you. The talks will be difficult, but with your help, I believe we can find a path forward." As the leader left the room, Larana felt a sense of purpose settle over her. The battle had been won, but the war for peace was just beginning, and she and Ethan would be at the forefront of it, leading their people toward a future that had once seemed impossible. Several days later, the colony held a celebration to honor the victory and the newfound alliance between humans and Zylthar. The celebration hall had been transformed into a scene of unity, decorated with symbols of both cultures. The air was filled with the sound of music and laughter, the tension of the past few weeks finally giving way to joy and hope. Larana and Ethan stood together in the center of the hall, surrounded by colonists and Sylthar alike. They had been greeted as heroes, their actions having forged a bond between their people that no one had thought possible. As the evening wore on, the crowd began to thin, leaving Larana and Ethan with a moment of quiet. They stood side by side, looking out over the celebration, the weight of their journey settling over them. "We've come so far," Larana said quietly, her voice filled with emotion. "But there's still so much to do." Ethan nodded, his gaze never leaving hers. "We'll do it together, as we always have. Side by side." Larana felt a warmth spread through her at his words, a sense of peace that had been absent for so long. They had faced unimaginable challenges, but through it all, they had found each other, and now they were ready to face whatever came next together. As the final act of the evening, Larana and Ethan made a decision that would forever symbolize the unity they had fought so hard to achieve. In a simple ceremony, surrounded by representatives of both species, they pledged themselves to each other not just as partners in peace, but as partners in life. The ceremony was brief, but the significance of it was profound. As they exchanged vows, Larana felt a sense of closure, a realization that she had found something she hadn't even known she was searching for. And as Ethan slipped a ring onto her finger, she knew that this was the beginning of a new chapter, not just for them, but for their people. The evening ended with a final message from the Zalthar High Council, acknowledging the challenges that lay ahead and the importance of the alliance that had been forged. It was a message of hope, but also of caution, a reminder that while the path to unity would be difficult, it was now possible thanks to Larana and Ethan's actions. As the celebration came to a close, Larana and Ethan stood together, hand in hand, looking out at the future they had helped create. The challenges they would face were many, but they knew that as long as they were together, they could overcome anything. "Whatever comes next," Larana said softly, "we'll face it together." Ethan smiled, his grip on her hand tightening. "Always." And with that, they stepped forward into the new dawn, ready to face whatever challenges the future held together.